where did C.S. Lewis lie on that denominational scale? Of course, he is known for mere Christianity, which is perhaps one of the farthest things you could get from Roman Catholicism on the Christian scale. But where did he lie on that scale, and how did he approach the question of different denominations?
Yes, that's right. So when I say that Tolkien wanted him to be able to share in his Christian faith, I think Tolkien was, well, he says he was sort of disappointed in a way that ultimately that Lewis, when he became a Christian, didn't become a Roman Catholic, which is, I think, ultimately what Tolkien would have liked. He says, instead of coming in through the new door, he's come back in through the old door of Ulster Protestantism. So that essentially he'd grown up as a Protestant. That was his upbringing in Belfast. And Lewis sort of reverted to that. So I think that was a disappointment for Tolkien. He was quite low church in a sense, Lewis. And he started attending, as soon as he became a theist, he started attending the college chapel at Magdalen. And also his home, his sort of parochial church in Headington, the sort of the Oxford suburb that he lived in, Holy Trinity, Headington. And he said that at the time that this was important to him as a way of what he calls flying my flag. So he wanted people to know he was a Christian and thought this was the way of demonstrating it. But he didn't have a lot of time for some of the kind of trappings of the sort of the higher church. So he famously didn't like organ music, for instance. As soon as the service finished, he would jump up, get straight out the door, because he also really didn't like all the small talk that goes on at the end of church, and the sort of perpetual organizing of things. He talks about, what a pain that all is. So he was quite low church, and so in that sense they were quite different. And you're right in saying that mere Christianity is quite different in that regard, quite deliberately so, I think. And we need to remember that mere Christianity began life as a series of radio broadcasts that were commissioned by the BBC to go out live on the radio beginning in 1941. So Britain during the Second World War, he was commissioned to give these talks as a way of introducing people to the Christian faith. So they were meant to be introductory, quite basic. And he was commissioned to do that because the head of religious broadcasting at the BBC had read his first work of apologetics, which was The Problem of Pain, which had come out in 1940. And it just happened that this man had read it and thought that this was somebody who could really communicate, who could write something that was accessible. They thought about who would you commission to do this? And of course, naturally, you turn to think the Archbishop of Canterbury and people. But then I think it was a rather inspired choice to say, what about a layman who has been an atheist, as we said earlier, someone who understands what the difficulties might be in accepting Christian doctrine, and who also is a very good communicator. And so the book itself had shown that, but also it's true that Lewis, as a professional academic and lecturer, was notoriously, in fact, in Oxford, an extremely engaging speaker, somebody who attracted large crowds to his lectures, which I'm sorry to say couldn't be said for Tolkien, who was apparently a great mumbler, and hardly anyone came to his lectures. But Tolkien people went to, Lewis people went to his lectures, and so he was known to be a good communicator. So that was the premise behind those talks, is that they were introductions to the Christian faith. He started off with the basics and trying to get people to think about, what are the kind of sort of the logical reasons why, right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe was the title of the first one, which really intended to make people think about, when you say that's not fair, what do you mean? What are you appealing to? What's the standard that you're invoking? For a nation at war, that was quite an important kind of insight, I think, to understand that that for a country to be invaded by another country, we can all agree is wrong. And so, what are the standards that we're applying in that kind of judgment? And so that was how those talks began. They were intended for a very wide popular audience. And they were published as individual kind of sort of pamphlets, really. The Case for Christianity was the first of these. But then after the war, he collected them together pretty much as they appeared on the radio, just slightly more formally, and then published them as what became Mere Christianity. And the phrase itself is not one that Lewis himself invented. It goes back to a kind of 17th century writer. But pure Christianity boiled down to its absolute elements. The belief that's been common to most Christians at all times, irrespective of what he himself chooses to believe. In fact, he's quite clear that this is what I'm trying to do, is communicate what all Christians hold in common. So it's deliberately really trying to avoid those kinds of doctrinal differences, irrespective of denomination, he says. And there's an interesting bit where he's talking about the actual becoming a Christian, and says, that there's a process in which it's like going into a big house, and you might come into the hallway, and that's the process of becoming the Christian, into the hallway. Now, off the hallway, there are lots of different doors which can open up into various different rooms, and those symbolize the many churches and traditions that you might want to affiliate yourself with. But then it's up to the individual to decide which room to go into, which is the right one for them. And you need to recognize individuals make different choices, and that it's important to be tolerant. When you've reached your own room, he says, be kind to those who've chosen different doors or those who are still in the hallway. So there is a real attempt to try and be tolerant, to remember that people have different preferences, different traditions. And so he's deliberately trying to avoid those kinds of doctrinal differences which so often do lead to difficulties. And one of the things he talks about there and elsewhere, Screwtape Letters is a good example of this. When you see Screwtape trying to corrupt the patient becomes a Christian. And so Screwtape is saying to his nephew Wormwood, one of the things you might want to try and do to try and deal with that problem is to get him involved in one of these new fads that's associated with Christianity. Things like Christianity in the New Order, or Christianity and spelling reform. And these are sorts of made up ideas which are intended to stand for something real, which is the sense that someone's come up with a better, more fashionable idea or approach to Christianity. And he says, what these things actually do is, what they really are is what he calls Christianity in water. They just dilute the faith. And so that I think is what the concept of mere Christianity is about. It's not diluted. It's the pure form of it.
Thanks for watching this short segment of an interview with Dr. Simon Horobin on C.S. Lewis. If you enjoyed this interview and want to watch the whole interview, you could check out the whole interview. The link will be in the description below. Furthermore, if you would like to listen to more interviews on leading scholars in the field, then make sure to like and subscribe to stay tuned to this channel. Also, if you would like to support us financially on Patreon to keep this mission sustainable and allow me to continue reaching out to these leading scholars, then consider checking us out on Patreon or YouTube memberships. Those would be brilliant ways to help support this platform. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next one. God bless and goodbye. I'll see you soon.